Hi, we welcome you to our fourth week on this study of the book of Revelation. My name's Vaughn, and on behalf of St. Thomas Episcopal Church, we're just delighted that you have decided to join us again this evening for this study. I want to start this evening with a very quick review of what we've done the first 3 weeks, as well as a general introduction of where we're headed today. But then we're going to need to just jump right in because there's a lot to cover here in week 4. So again, thank you for joining us. All right, in week 1, we looked at the fact that Jesus really turns out to be the key to the book of Revelation. It's not the end of time, it's not the future, it's not something that's going to happen to the church or to the world at large. It's all about Jesus. In chapters 2 and 3, there was an image of Jesus that was referred back to in chapter 1, verses 13 through 18, that becomes sort of the organizing principle for each of 7 letters that John will end up writing on behalf of Jesus to each of 7 different churches. And by means of 7 churches being introduced, it's really a message that goes out to all of the churches at that time and from that time since. And each one of those letters, in its own particularly different way, ends up being a crucial statement of how it is that we as God's people are able not only to survive, but actually to thrive as the people of God in a world that in many ways is hostile to the church. In chapters 4 and 5, which we looked at last week, it was a bit of a pause. It was a moment for us to kind of catch our breath based on what all we saw in chapters 2 and 3. And it was a pause that takes place in heaven itself, where chapter 4 saw us around the throne room of God, with God seated on the throne, and all of creation around God offering praise to God. And then in chapter 5 appears on the scene a slain lamb that surprisingly is standing, who is worthy to be able to reach out and receive from God a book that God has that is obviously sealed up, but that God wishes to share with his people. That gets us to the end of chapter 5 and ready to jump in to where we're going to go now in chapters 6 and 7. One other quick thing, though. Today, it's going to be the story of how God's work is beginning to be disclosed as that slain but standing lamb begins to break each one of the seals on the scroll that he now has in his hand. And as he does so, the text that has been sealed up from the very beginning of time is open. And by the time we get to the end, the rest of the book of Revelation is going to be what was in that particular book. Now, there are 7 seals. The first time I remember ever really thinking about there being 7 seals on this book, maybe you had the same situation in your life, but as a little kid thinking about that, I thought that was just one of the strangest ideas in the world, for there to be 7 seals on a book, because I didn't know about seals that could be plastered on a book. I just thought about seals, the kind that you would see in the zoo, and it was such a strange image in my young mind to think about there being 7 seals. Well, that's not the kind of seal that was on this book. It was the kind of seal that would be produced by a signet ring that a king or another ruler or authority would wear, that he would pour some wax upon the book and then put his signet ring into that, making an impression or a seal that you would know it had not been opened up as long as that seal had not been broken. And so this particular scroll has 7 of those seals that are actually on the book. Here's what one of those signet rings, as well as the kind of seal that it would make, might have looked like. And this is from the 1st century, and it shows you an image of a sort of warrior military figure in this particular instance. A couple of thoughts about what we're going to see as we work our way through chapter 6, especially. Each one of these seals, when broken, is going to release something that gives us a bit of understanding of what is taking place all the time in our world. It's not part of the book itself. It's part of what hides the contents of the book itself. There are those who approach each of these 7 seals as if they are eras of history through which the world has been moving across time. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to that. I don't think that they are periods of world history. Rather, they are aspects of life that tend to hide God's will from us so that it's harder for us to understand what it is we're experiencing and why it is that we may be experiencing that at any particular moment in time. But as I said, the rest of the book of Revelation is going to be the actual contents that are made available to us once the seals are off of the now open scroll. So with no more ado, let's just jump into the scripture text, and I'll read it for you. If you don't have a Bible handy already, be sure to pause the video for just a moment, grab yourself a Bible, and have it open with you for the rest of the session this evening. All right, here we go. Chapter 6. I, John, watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. And then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come!" And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come!" And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. And when the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." And when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. And when he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony that they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" And then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants and brothers and sisters were killed, just as they had been. And I watched as he opened the 6th seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. And the stars in the sky fell to the earth as late figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. And then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" And after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. And then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea, "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servant of our God." And then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. From the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. From the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures. And they fell down on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen." And then one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they? And where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and have made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Well, just as the 7 letters in chapters 2 and 3 followed a very standard form, so the various groups of 7 that we're going to encounter, beginning in these chapters and continuing through the rest of the chapters, they too are going to be following a standard form. Here in these chapters, we've looked at seals. In chapters 8 and 9, we're going to look at trumpets. In chapters 12 and 13, there will be scenes of conflict. And then in chapters 15 and 16, there are going to be bowls of wrath. And as I said, there's a form that each of these groups of 7 follow. Here's the form. It's really a very simple one, but it is a form that they each take. There will be the first 4 in that series of 7 that will be described very succinctly in just a verse or two, and then they'll move on. 4 are done that way. They will then be followed by 2 additional items in that series of 7 that are going to be described at a little bit more length. In some instances, there will be a lot more said about each of those 2. Following the 4 and following the 2, there will be a pause. It may be a short pause or interlude. It may be a lengthy pause or interlude, but there will be some kind of an interlude preceding then the last or the 7th in that series of 7 that we look at. Now, in this particular instance, we're looking at seals on a scroll. And this is, in some ways, the most infamous of the list of 7, or at least it is the list of 7 that often is referred to the most often from the book of Revelation. We'll start again with a woodcut from Albrecht Dürer, and you can see in this particular woodcut the 4 horsemen, often referred to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, all side by side, beginning to now rage war upon God's people. Those particular horsemen take a number of different forms. Here's one that you'll see that was by the great painter Benjamin West. These have become, in a way, sort of a cultural phenomenon, and so they are used to refer to all kinds of things. Those of you who are sports addicts will recognize very quickly that these are the Notre Dame football horsemen from back in the early part of the 20th century. If that's not your cup of tea, maybe worldwide wrestling is, then you may remember from 30 years back or so Ric Flair and his 4 horsemen. Bottom line is that each one of the horsemen and their horses are of different colors, and and they represent different aspects of life as we know them. And so they are depicted in ways for us to be able to tell that, as you can see from each of these slides that I'm presenting. But as I said, they're also a cultural phenomenon, and so the cartoons and comic strips that employ these four horsemen are just almost endless. Some of them are political. I've chosen not to use a current political cartoon, but I've used one from about a dozen years ago, involving at the time John McCain when he was running for president. Sometimes they're looking at other aspects of contemporary life, and sometimes they're just having fun with the four horsemen. This is one that has not been out very long at all, but you'll recognize it very quickly from the pandemic that we've been having to deal with for the last several months. All right, the first seal is broken in the first couple of verses. I need to mention on the front end that this image of the different colored horses comes from the book of Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, which is right at the very tail end of the Old Testament. But in case you are thinking as you read through this, or as you listened to it just a few moments ago, that this really was kind of a strange thing for John to be talking about, he has gotten this image, as all of these other things that he's speaking of, out of the Old Testament. And in the first century, the book of Zechariah, unlike today, was a very popular book that many Jews were quite familiar with. So the fact that John takes this image out of the book of Zechariah would not have seemed strange at all to any of God's people in the first century. All right, the first seal is broken by the slain but standing lamb. And when he breaks it, John is then enabled to see a rider on a white horse. Now, often we think, based on images in film over the last 100 years, as well as literature itself, that somebody on a white horse is obviously on our side and is a good guy. But in this particular instance, this is not a good guy, and unlike some persons interpreting the book of Revelation, this is not an image of Jesus. Just bar that on the front end. This is not Jesus that we're looking at here. Literally, it is very likely that what John is describing with this rider on a horse that has a bow in his hand are the Parthians. This was one of those enemies that just absolutely terrified the first century Roman Empire, because the Parthians on the far eastern edge of the empire, right on the boundary along the Euphrates River, were a people that the Romans had never been able to conquer. And in the early 60s, just a generation prior to John writing, there had been another uprising, and yet again, Rome had been defeated on the boundaries of the Euphrates River. What made this particular people so terrifying and hard to defeat? They were a people who had learned how not just to ride horses, not just to use horses in warfare, but to be able to actually use their bows and the arrows that are shot while they are astride the horse in full gallop. Think, for instance, our own American West. It was of all the various Indian tribes, whether we're talking the Kiowa or the Arapaho or the Sioux or the Apache, it was the Comanches who cast the most fear into the hearts of those American soldiers in the West, because of their ability to fire their weapons, whether it was a rifle or a bow, shooting an arrow, while they were astride at full gallop, their horses. Well, that's what it probably would have meant literally, but this is a symbol, and so it also has symbolic content. And this rider astride a horse is representing military conquest. It's combat. It is war. It is the subduing of other nations by force that is being represented by this first of the seven seals that are broken. When we move to the second of the seals, this time John sees when the seal is broken a red horse, a rider on a red horse. So this one can't represent military warfare, but in the absence, in the follow-up, if you will, of military warfare, this is a rider who represents terrorist attacks, guerrilla warfare, the sort of internal disorder that pits one person against another. Civil strife, assassinations, murders, conspiracy, even the kinds of squabbling that takes place between neighbors over their back fence regarding boundaries, or their dog going to the bathroom on each other's property. Who knows what causes the issues? But in the absence of peace, which we're told in these verses is the case, this particular writer is able to take away peace when he brandishes the sword. He doesn't actually kill anyone, but in the absence of peace, he sets neighbor against neighbor. And the kinds of internal strife that arises in the meantime creates a sort of civil strife that everybody has to deal with. And while we may or may not have been in a war as a combatant, we've certainly had these kinds of issues with others in almost every aspect of our life, I suspect. The third seal, when it is broken, John sees a rider this time upon a black horse. There are those who think that this particular rider and his horse represents famine, and that's a pretty good idea, but I think it goes a bit further than that actually, because famine is going to be a part of what we see with the next rider and its horse. This particular rider, even though it's holding a pair of scales in its hand, doesn't exactly represent famine. Rather, it represents the kind of politically induced scarcity that results because of the way that people are living. Basic commodities that everybody should be able to have access to are beginning to be measured out, remember the scales, are beginning to be measured out at exorbitant prices, or to these people but not those people. In short, it's a politically induced kind of scarcity, the kind of scarcity that existed in Pharaoh's Egypt. Exactly the opposite of what exists in God's kingdom, where there is always abundance. We're told in the midst of this particular portion of these seals being broken that the people who are alive have to spend a day's wage upon either a quart of wheat or upon 3 quarts of barley. In other words, they're spending all of their hard-earned money just being able to buy the basic essentials, foodstuffs of life itself. There's nothing left over to be able to spend on the luxuries or the things that we might like to make life nicer. There's just not anything available for that. So all that these people have are spent just on the most basic of commodities. This isn't a part of the text itself, really, but it's one of those things I've often wondered about. Notice that wheat is a whole lot more expensive. It's 3 times more expensive than barley. If the family unit is just me and maybe myself and a spouse, I might be able to spend my monies that I have earned, my day's wage, on wheat. We could share that. But if I have a family, if there are several kids in my family, 1 quart of wheat is nowhere close enough to be able to feed my entire family. So I have to purchase a much cheaper foodstuff. I have to purchase barley, which was much cheaper. It would fill my stomach. It would keep me alive till tomorrow. And it was all that was available for me if I'm trying to feed an entire family and not just me and maybe one more person. Keeping that in mind, I've often wondered why it is in the church that we represent our meal, symbolically represent our meal of Holy Eucharist as being of wine and wheat, when in fact the little boy who first shared his meal with Jesus' disciples in that miracle that is the only miracle recorded by all 4 of the gospel writers, it says very specifically that he did not share in that meal wheat rolls. He shared barley loaves. it seems to me that our Eucharist ought to be symbolized not by wine and wheat, but by wine and barley. Just throw that in as extra in this lesson. Notice as well that there's a comment made that despite the cost of the basic commodities, this particular writer is not to touch the wine or the oil. The luxuries, the extravagances that the rich and powerful enjoy, those are not to be measured or stopped in any way. Curiously, on a literal historic level, just a few years before John would have written this particular text, there was in fact a famine that hit the Roman Empire, and there was not enough foodstuffs available. And so Domitian, to his honor, the emperor actually requested that folks in Asia Minor plow under their vineyards and plant crops of wheat and barley and corn to be able to feed the empire. And their response was, no thank you, we're keeping our vineyards, which was something that only the rich were able to really enjoy. So this third seal, when it is broken, I think it refers to politically induced scarcity. The fourth seal, when it is broken, when that rider appears on his horse, this time it is a pale horse. It is death that is on the horse and followed very quickly by Hades. Not Gehenna, hell, but Hades, the grave, where the dead reside. Notice that in the midst of this particular unsealing of the text, that there is a limitation that is very specifically placed on the extent to which this particular writer can wield his effect. He can only affect 1/4 of the population of the earth by means of famine or plague or wild beasts or by sword. Now, I think we should not take that fraction literally as if it is specifically 25% of the world that is affected. I think we should step back from that and just realize that what we're being told is that this particular writer will not affect everybody. It's just a partial. And if that, it's even a very small partial, just 25%. Granted, that's a lot, but 25% compared to 100% is really not much at all. It's just very partial. Okay, these horsemen are not following each other currently or sequentially or chronologically. They are rather recurrent themes that we continue across all of world history to have to deal with, whether it's war or civil strife or politically induced scarcity or even death and plagues and pestilence of various kinds. These are happening all the time, and we just have to learn to deal with them. I think we should not assume on the basis of these 4 seals that the world is somehow on borrowed time, but rather we should conclude that the world as we know it is on borrowed time. Because what we're about to be discovering here is how God's salvation is wiping away the status quo and replacing it with the kingdom of God. So the world is not at its end, but the world as we know it is almost at its end. All right, the 5th seal. This is a seal, when it is broken, that refers very differently to the first 4. Whereas the first 4 affected all people everywhere all the time, wherever they're at in terms of time, this particular seal is affecting more specifically God's people. It's referring to martyrdom, to those souls that are under the altar, wearing their white robes and wondering how long it's going to be before God avenges their death. They are saying while they are under the altar, "How long, O Lord?" It is a cry that rises from their lips, and it isn't so much worried about personal vengeance for themselves, but rather the kind of concern for God's reputation. If God, in fact, cares for his church, why is it that so many in God's church suffer because of being a Christian? Why is it that the world's hostility so impacts the church, if in fact God loves us and cares for us in a special way? That's what we're about to get an answer for as we work our way through the text today. In the early years of the church, some of the writers, especially Tertullian, by the time you get it to about the year 200, they're beginning to see martyrdom not just as the bearing of verbal witness to Jesus, but the actual killing of the person because of their words that they speak on Jesus' behalf. And they don't so much see suffering as an evil to be avoided. They see it rather as a strength that enables the church to actually be the church in the midst of all that is happening around us. In fact, Tertullian's famous line, which continues to be repeated in some circles even to this day, is that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Now, you and I may not want to suffer martyrdom. We may not want to be killed for our faith, but at a very deep understanding, at a very deep level, Tertullian, as well as many in the early church, realized the importance of living like Jesus in such close proximity to Jesus that we, in fact, experience the same kind of thing at the end of our life as Jesus did, martyrdom for God. You'll notice that down in verse 10, there is a reference to the inhabitants of the earth. This is a phrase that we've already seen once, back in chapter 3, verse 10, and we're going to see it a total of 9 times across the pages of the book of Revelation. This is the phrase that John uses when he wants to talk about those who are not a part of the people of God. When he wants to talk about what we would probably just say are the evil people in the world, or the hell-bound, or whatever phrase that comes to your lips. His phrase is the inhabitants of the earth. That should be placed in contrast to another phrase, every nation, tribe, language, and people. That phrase happens 5 times in the book of Revelation. That is a phrase that John consistently uses for the church, or for God's people more generally. Every nation, tribe, language, and people. So for John, in the book of Revelation, he doesn't divide the world between, for instance, Jew and Gentile. He divides the world between the inhabitants of the earth and every nation, tribe, language, and people. The inhabitants of the earth, notice here in chapter 6, let me pull it up and actually read it so I get it exactly correct. How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth? That's the church, the martyrs, asking how long before you, God, deal with those that are not a part of us, when you deal with the evil ones. Well, the answer that they receive is, until your number is complete. That may not be what you and I want to hear. We might wish to have God say to us, well, I'll deal with it right now and take care of it. But God puts them off, at least initially, and says, until your number is complete, which says a couple of things. There are going to be more people who die from martyrdom, just like you have. But it also is a wonderful message of hope that lets us know that the things for which I am standing, the things to which I am bearing witness, the things that I am trying to do on behalf of God's kingdom, should I be put to death, should I be neutralized, as it were, by the hostile world around me, I don't need to be concerned about that. I don't need to fear, because there will be another rise to take my place right behind me. So the effort that I'm expending, it's not because of who I am. It's not because of my talents or abilities or skills. It is God working through me. And when I am no more, there will be somebody else come to take my place, and the world will never defeat us. There will always be another to come along behind us and to continue the work that was begun initially by Jesus. We're all going to die. That day is coming, and most of us who are probably listening to this evening, we're very much on the downside of life at this point, and so we can't pretend any longer that we will not die. Rather, the question for us is not will we die, but rather for what will we die? Or will our death ultimately have meaning and purpose? What will be the meaning and purpose of my life when somebody thinks about me or writes about me at some time in the future? This particular breaking of a seal lets us know that God is in charge of all of this and really has things under control. The sixth seal, when it is broken, this is now down in verses 12 through 17. There are those who think that this is a reference to the kinds of natural calamities that our world rather consistently has to face. The earthquakes and the avalanches and the hurricanes and tornadoes that strike our planet and sometimes kill lots and lots of people and seem to presage the end of time itself, sort of a doomsday toward which the world is kind of irrevocably moving toward. I think, again, it represents something very different in John's usage. John is not just thinking about life writ large. He's thinking very specifically in terms of, again, Old Testament metaphors and images. And in the Old Testament, each one of the things that are listed here, whether it's the moon or the sun or the sky or whatever, each of those are images taken from the Old Testament that are referring very specifically to God being present among his people, working wonders among them on their behalf in a world that is hostile to them. If we step back far enough, the phrase that is used regarding this particular incident is the day of the Lord, the time when God finally says, here is how I judge this situation. These are the righteous, these are the unrighteous. That's where this particular breaking of the seal is headed. When I was, maybe 13 or 14 years of age, I'd grown up in Kansas City, but my grandparents lived on a farm right here in northwest Arkansas, where I'm now living. My grandfather, who was a carpenter, farmer in the area, asked me, I think this was about this point in time in September, 45, 50 years ago now. He asked me, would I like to help him put a roof on Mrs. McCord's house, which was kind of just around the corner and a few blocks away. I said, sure. I had just in school, not very long before this, gotten my hands on a copy of Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth and had read it. This was not something I learned in church. It was something that I read from that particular book. I'm on top of Mrs. McCord's house. It's in the evening. It's getting toward dark. And as we're putting the roof on the house, I noticed that the full moon is no longer white as it often is, but is turning this reddish color. And the longer that we worked on that roof, that moon kept getting darker and darker red. It seemed to me on top of that roof like it was a blood red. And having read Hal Lindsey, I knew that this was presaging the end of the world and the coming of Jesus, and that there was bound to be a trumpet heard up in the sky at some point at any moment. And I was holding my breath. I was hammering nails into those shingles, but I was holding my breath and afraid as all get out, because I just knew that red moon was going to elicit a trumpet blast at any point in time, and I could not understand for the life of me why my grandpa was not any more concerned on that roof than he was. But of course, I was the one who was completely mistaken, because this has nothing to do with what Hal Lindsey talked about. It has to do with what John was talking about, with what was shared with him by Jesus. It is the day of the Lord on which God acts on behalf of all God's people. Well, there's so much more I'd like to say about that, but I need to keep moving on, so let me just say this. Notice down in verse 15 that there are a group of people who do respond, kind of the way that I did up on top of Miss McCord's roof. Kings and rulers and princes and generals and the mighty and so forth are scared to death. And in the midst of a world that seems to be coming apart at the seams as far as they are concerned, they begin to cry out to the very things that are causing them such destruction. The mountains and the rocks, they cry out to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Really? From the wrath of the Lamb? It's amazing how self-deluded our sin can end up making us, where even the very gifts that God wishes to share with us, we think are somehow intended to harm us, rather than to care and provide and save us. But that's where these folks are at this particular moment. And notice how many of those people there are. Did you count them? There are 7 different kinds of people, from the highest to the very lowest. 7, which should represent all people, all the inhabitants of the earth. Well, who can stand? Who can withstand the wrath of the Lamb is an interesting question. They're not so concerned about the first 4 seals that might concern us the most. They're concerned about standing before a righteous God. Well, I guess we're all kind of concerned about that, aren't we? All right. Let's move on to chapter 7. Once again, Albrecht Dürer offers us a wonderful way to think about this chapter. This chapter. John allows the smoke from each of those 7 seals that have been broken and the various peoples that are parading across there on the horses, or the things that are happening to the world around, to begin to kind of clear a bit. And what he sees in the midst of this chapter are, in fact, God's faithful. Not just withstanding all that they're facing, but actually standing and offering praise to God. But we've got to get to the end of the chapter to actually see that. And I need to say this on the front end. Hopefully you'll see it by the time we get to the end of the chapter, but I need to tell you on the front end. Most of the time when we read a book, we tend to just read it at a level where we think, okay, page 2, events that are on page 2 simply follow the events on page 1. Events on page 3 follow those on page 2, etc., etc. But the events that are occurring here in chapter 7 are not events that follow sequentially after the events of chapter 6. What is taking place in chapter 7 is an interlude. It is a pause in which God's people are offered an answer to the questions that they asked and that they heard the world asking in chapter 6. And so it is a flashback to an earlier time, giving us some information that we need to have if we're going to have the answer to the questions that were asked earlier. Now in film, we know how this works all the time. Somebody's eyes will cross, or the focus of the camera will go dim or fuzzy, or maybe they'll spin, or the entire scene will turn black, and there'll be some strange, eerie music sound, and then everything will come back into focus. Their eyes will no longer cross, and the music will stop, and we know that we have drifted back in time to receive some important information. And then, in the midst of the film, when we find ourselves back with the main person, and their eyes stop crossing, or they open back up, or we see the mental light bulb going off, we know that we can now proceed with the story, having received from the past this important bit of information. That's how chapter 7 is going to function. And here's why I say that. Look very carefully at verse 1. It opens this time talking not about horses, but about winds, W-I-N-D-S. But this image, just like chapter 6, actually comes from Zechariah chapter 6. Zechariah 6, 1 through 8 starts off talking about these horses, multicolored horses, or at least differently colored horses. When you get to verses 4 and 5, the image shifts. And he stops talking about horses, but starts talking about winds. And it's clear from reading Zechariah that the horses are in fact the winds. Now, that just doesn't make any sense at all to us, except for the fact that we recognize that that's where John is getting the image. And because that's what Zechariah did, that's what John is doing with the very same passage. So the horses from chapter 6 are the winds in chapter 7. And look what is going on now with these winds. Before they have a chance to blow and wreak their destruction across the planet, there is a mighty angel that appears and causes the four winds to be held back, unable to do anything until God is able to seal his people to protect them from whatever it is that the destruction that those four winds are going to reap. And this is a wonderful image that I've got on the slide right this moment that lets you see those four angels holding back the winds that are in their hands. In fact, they have their hands over the mouth, the blowing part of each of those skulls. Here's another instance in which the angels are holding back the wind so that they cannot yet blow. That angel shows up in the east, or from the east. Well, the east is where God lives. It's God's habitation. Eden, for instance, was in the east. It's why the sanctuaries in which we worship are always in the eastern portion of our churches. We have the nave separated by the chancel from the sanctuary, which is in the east. And even in churches where the architecture doesn't support that, literally, we still refer to it as the ecclesiastical east. And it's why when we stand up, we stand and we face the east. Because if, in fact, Jesus were to come in the midst of our prayers, we want to be facing Jesus, speaking to him when he arrives. It's why Jesus has said that when he returns, he's going to come to the Mount of Olives, there to the east of Jerusalem. In the Tennessee Conference of the United Methodist Church, which is where I served all of the years when I was a clergy person serving local churches, there was an old Methodist clergyman who died in 1845 in Athens, Alabama, who, when he was buried, he had left instructions that when he was buried, he did not want his casket to be laid in the ground. He wanted his casket to be placed into the ground vertically, so that when the trumpet sounded, he didn't have to waste any time getting to his feet. He could just take off after Jesus toward the east when Jesus finally appeared. I've always liked that story and thought that was pretty cool. Be a great way to die, standing up. God is going to seal his people. He's going to put a mark upon them. Well, that's the very thing that Paul tells us in the first chapter of the book of Ephesians. When I referred to it last week, it's also the same thing that he says in chapter 8 of his letter to the church in Rome, beginning at about verse 28 and continuing through verse 39. People on whom God has placed a mark, there is not finally anything that the world can do to them. Yeah, it can kill them, but it can't really harm them. What a neat way to think about that. I rewatched a part of the 1982 film Gandhi, in which Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi. If you need to have your spirit lifted and strengthened by scenes that's the movie you need to go out tonight and rent or watch tomorrow. Especially look for the scene in which Gandhi convinces the Indians to march not upon the sea, but to march upon the salt lakes, and the Indian people standing up to the kind of treatment that they received from the English in 1930. It will thrill your soul, and you'll have a good understanding of what John is saying here in chapters 6 and 7, where God protects his people, and even though they are killed, they are not harmed in any way whatsoever. Well, down in verse 4, there's a number that is expressed, 144,000. For us who live in a world full of billions and billions of people, 144,000 sounds like a pretty small number. But in John's day, it was thought to be a huge number, not by any stretch the largest number one could ever imagine, but it was a large number. And it was a perfect number. It was 10 times 10 times 10 times 12 times 12. It was this marvelously perfect number. And that's the number that John hears of all of those people who have been sealed. And so he hears that number, and he hears other things happening as well, and there begins to be this litany of people named off in verses 5 through 8. It's the tribes of Israel that begin to be named. Now, they're not in any kind of geographical order. They're not in any sort of chronological order in terms of their birth to Jacob. In fact, there's not any order whatsoever. Don't look for any, because there's not. And in fact, one of the tribes is missing, it replaced by another one of Joseph's sons. So there's not really any particular rhyme or reason other than the fact that they represent the 12 tribes. But what is important is the number that we hear connected to them. What he hears is that there are 12,000 from the tribe of Judah. There are 12,000 from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 from the tribe of Gad, 12,000 from Asher, and so on, working all the way down to Benjamin, equaling 144,000. Well, by this point, it should occur to us that we're hearing Numbers 1. We're hearing 1 Chronicles 4, 5, 6, 7 taking place. This is a great census being taken of God's people, so that the military authorities know how many men of fighting age are available to create God's army. A huge army of 144,000 fighting men. A perfect fighting army established to defend God's kingdom. But just when we get our minds around that particular number, something else occurs. This is now the third or fourth time that we've heard this occur. John hears A, and he turns and he sees B. For instance, back in chapter 1, he heard a voice like a trumpet. And when he turned and looked, what he saw was the Son of Man. Or, down in chapter 5, he heard this Lion of the tribe of Judah. And when he turned, what he saw was a slain but standing lamb. Now, in this particular chapter, what he hears is God's army. And when he turns to look at God's army, what he sees is a multitude beyond count of white-robed martyrs. These are not two different kinds of people, two different groupings of people. These are exactly the same people. The 144,000 person army of God is in fact an uncountable number of white-robed martyrs. It is not we who fight God's battle. God fights that battle for God's own self. We are just there bearing witness to all that God is doing among us and for us and with us. Well, look at those white-robed multitude now that appear. They are from every nation, tribe, language, and people. There's no stopping the church's growth and spread throughout the entire world. There is no longer Jew or Gentile. There is no longer slave or free or male or female. They're all part of God's people. And they're all wearing white robes. Way back in chapters 2 and 3, Jesus' message to each of the 7 churches was to stand strong, and you will be able to conquer in the midst of all of the hostilities of the world around you. And now we see that, in fact, they have. They have all emerged victorious. They are all white-robed martyrs, those who've been able to maintain their faith and their witness no matter what has happened to them across the years of their life. And suddenly, when you get down to verses 10, 11, and 12, what do you discover but that we are back in heaven itself, and all of these white-robed martyrs, the entire multitude of God's people, have now joined the 24 elders, the 4 living creatures, and all of the others who are around God's throne offering praise and worship to God. It is a moving scene that occurs here at the tail end of chapter 7. Just a wonderful way to think about what is taking place. And then there is verse 14, which, in the way that some people interpret the book of Revelation, functions like this terribly bad wet blanket that just smothers out all of the wonderfully joy-filled things that we've been talking about as we've worked our way through chapter 7. Because in verse 14, and I'll read it to you in case you don't know what it says, here's what happens in verse 14. One of the elders has sidled up to John and almost prodding him like this, saying, so who are all of these white-robed martyrs? And John, for his sake, he refuses even to answer. He just says, sir, you know. And so the elder then gives this answer as to who they are. These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. There is no way under the sun that John, after all of the wonderful things he has showed us in chapter 7, would have thrown that kind of a wet blanket on what he has just got through telling us and showing us. This chapter is ending on a gloriously high note, even in the midst of this particular word. The tribulation is not some terribly nasty thing that is going to happen somewhere in the future. Remember, chapter 7 is a flashback. It is going back in time prior to the events of chapter 6 to provide us an answer as to how it is, why it is that we can in fact stand strong and ultimately conquer no matter what it is we face in this hostile world in which we live. So then what is the tribulation? Well, it is that through which all of God's people, all the 144,000, have passed. Now, from the rest of Scripture, we know that when Jesus returns, there will be some who are dead, and there are some who will be alive. So the tribulation cannot represent death, if in fact it is that through which all of God's people have passed. Well, what then is the tribulation? What is the most terrible thing that you can think of? What is the most widespread thing that you can think of? That all of God's people, those who lived centuries ago, those who are living now, those who will live centuries from now, what is it that we have all experienced? Well, I'd suggest there's only one thing that all of God's people of all time, no matter where they live, have passed. And that is life itself. The tribulation is life. The word means the pressing down, the turning into gruel, the mushing of grains to where they're just powder. Well, isn't that what life does to us? It just grinds us up. It isn't death that does that to us. It's life, and it's the events that we live through on a day-to-day basis, whether it is the neighbor that just tries our soul, or the job that takes away all joy from us, or the bad relationship that we're in, or whatever. Regardless of whether we live a short amount of time or a long amount of time, whether it's long ago or right today, the one thing that we've all lived through is life. And John says that God has protected us in the midst of this life. We bear the seal of God on our foreheads, long before those winds could blow, long before any of the events in chapter 6 could even begin to take place. God has sealed his people from harm. No wonder at the end of chapter 7 they're all in heaven, even because of the tribulation, standing and praising the Lamb around the throne of God. It's reason for us to praise God and look forward to what we see next week in chapters 8 and 9. Thanks for being a part of it this evening.